Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ian Campbell. I'm Vice President of Operations at PACICC. I am the staff lead for the Risk Officers Forum, and I'm your moderator for this afternoon's broadcast. So welcome, thanks for joining us today, and a special welcome to first-timers who are joining us this afternoon. This is our final webinar of the year. I want to thank my colleague, Danica Hall, Manager of Operations, for her work behind the scenes to make this broadcast successful. I encourage you to relax and enjoy yourself over the next 90 minutes of discussion. We have some very interesting subject matter and some very engaging speakers. I wanted to first let you know that you can learn a lot. I want to tell you personally, you can learn a lot from Risk Officers Forum events. You'll recall at our September 15th forum, we had Rob Wessling, CEO of Cooperators, on the line, and he talked to us about flood risk in Canada. And I was talking with our President and CEO, Alistair Campbell, about this after the fact. Rob, during the broadcast, gave you a link to test whether or not your house, your abode is in the line of fire for a flood. And he went online during the broadcast and checked his own personal circumstance. And he said, "Did you check?" And I said, "No, I didn't. Really, what's the chance of that?" So 2 nights later, my basement flooded. And so I'm kind of worried. Today we're looking at solar storms. And my wife asked when I left the office this morning, she said, "What's the focus of today's broadcast?" And I told her solar storms. And she said, "Oh, no." So I hope we don't get zapped 2 days from now. So I'm going to ask, thanks very, very much, Danica, for putting up the agenda for today. Housekeeping items I will begin with. Then I'm going to throw it over to Alistair Campbell, and he's going to give some words of welcome. I will then take back control and introduce our experts who will be talking about solar storms and the risks they present to the electrical grid in Canada. Then we will close the broadcast by looking at our final forum event meeting of the year. That's on November 17th. And I'll talk to you about the satisfaction survey that you will be presented with tomorrow. So first, the housekeeping items. Everyone is now familiar in this COVID world with MS Teams. You know the ground rules. Thanks very much for muting yourself and turning off your video. If you have a question or a comment during the broadcast, we certainly invite it in real time. So use the little icon, the put your hand up. You'll be recognized. We'll ask you to turn on your video, turn on your audio, and you can ask your question of our speakers or provide comment, and then we will mute you and disable your video. We want to make this very interactive, very collegial. And while the thought is in your head, put it to our panelists for discussion. And I saw somebody's testing the hand up feature there. No, good, okay. Antitrust compliance is in effect. The Competition Act is in full force. If you have a question about that, generally speaking, the answer is no. There's to be no collusion, no approaches to business strategies, no claims adjusting practices, discussion of that, scopes of coverage, resolution of mixed claims, and/or management of third-party vendors and service providers. Our lawyers like to hear us give that disclaimer to start the broadcast. This meeting is being recorded, and that will be of interest to your colleagues who are not able to join us for this afternoon's broadcast, but they can find it on our website shortly afterwards for rebroadcast. Now I'm going to throw things over to Alistair Campbell, our President and CEO, to welcome you here today, and I will be back.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks everyone for joining. I will be very brief here, simply to say that the PACICC year has been an action-packed one in a year that has been extraordinarily challenging for the whole industry. And while COVID has thrown many curveballs, through 6 months, the industry results are strong, which positions, from a solvency perspective, our industry in a fantastic place to help support the economic recovery of Canada post-COVID. From a PACICC specific perspective, the one thing I did want to say was thank you to so many of the member insurers represented here today for their engagement in our consultation on whether or not we should be purchasing reinsurance on behalf of the industry. We sent out a paper in July. We received feedback from just short of 90% of the industry. And that will be presented, all that feedback will be presented to our board on November 4th. It was a fantastic dialogue on an interesting and quite new topic. Obviously, perhaps of interest to our speakers from Munich and Swiss today. But let's get to them immediately now. I'll just hand over to Ian again, but maybe just to flag, we've had very strong interest in this particular session. and have accepted invitations from member insurers representing, I think, 65 organizations from Vancouver to Antigonish. So our guest speakers are speaking to the whole industry from across our extraordinary country. It is wonderful to keep our members engaged and thinking about emerging risks, possible risks, tail risks. And in that context, we have at our Risk Fora and webinar series looked at a lot of topics, but this is a new one for us. And when it was first surfaced by our Risk Officers Advisory Committee, it was unexpected, and it took us a while to find exactly the right people to help us think about it. We've now done that, and I'm very excited that we have two really outstanding presenters joining us today. They are both doing so at the end of their work days, both located in Central Europe. So we're really grateful for the extra time they're carving out of their personal lives to present to us today. So both Eric and Jan, thank you both. Ian, back to you.
Thanks very much, Alistair. And as Alistair mentioned, they're beaming to us live from Central Europe. So we have on the line Dr. Eric Durand, Head Cyber Center of Competence and Director of Swiss Re Institute, and also of Swiss Re Management Ltd, and Dr. Jan Eichner, Senior Consultant, Corporate Underwriting Non-Life with Munich Re. So very pleased to have you here. And this is going to be very interactive, this broadcast. I think we're going to hear from either speaker, and then we will throw it open for general discussion, and each has slides that they will walk you through. And the slide, they were making adjustments to the slide presentation right up to broadcast. So that's why you didn't get slides ahead of time, but certainly we will ask our speakers for follow-up slides that can be shared with you later on. And of course, you would see it again in the rebroadcast, but it's always good to have a takeaway from our webinars. So I'll put that out to our speakers later on that we certainly would appreciate your slides. And I guess we'll throw it over to Eric and Jan. Thank you very much for being here.
Yes, hello, and thank you for having us. And Eric, how do we, should I start with the presentation or you? I think I start. Because yes, your presentation at some point will catch up from where I stop. I think that was exactly how we agreed on. Yep. Okay, great. So let me now share my screen. It might take a while until I've figured out the correct setting. Here we go. So I will speak about solar storm risk, and I will mainly cover the part of all the physics and technology behind it until we end up at a scenario that then will kind of be, or yeah, the starting point also for Eric to take over, who also then digs into the technical aspects of the scenario and what that means, what that would mean for insurance, for the insurance industry. So let's start with some general information on power grids or the electricity sector in Canada. I think this is like everywhere. You have always these 4 steps. It starts with the generation, with the power plants. Then the electricity needs to be sent to a distribution area where it ends up at the consumer. And the central part here is the transmission. The transmission is what it's all about here. Just some facts, some trivia. So in Canada, 60% of your electricity is generated through hydro, which is, I think, from a climate change or climate protection aspect, pretty excellent. You're a net seller of energy to the US. You're creating more energy than you actually need, more electricity, and this is sent to the US through 35 connections that you have in the south. And what you see, if you look on the right side here on the map, you see that your transmission grid, the purple lines here, pretty much has a very extreme or pronounced north-south direction. So you have all the hydropower plants and maybe also coal plants, because you have all the oil sands and coal in the north. You have the energy generated in the north, and then it's sent towards the south where all the people live for the distribution and the consumption. Yeah. How do blackouts occur in Canada? This is a list of some major blackouts that affected North America, so the US as well as Canada, but I selected those where Canada clearly was affected as well. And if you just have this list is totally not complete, but if you have just a brief look at what I've written here in red, what the causes were, you see human error, you see one solar storm, you see multiple severe storms. So clearly what one can say is that severe storms, bad weather, ice storms. This is really the main cause for large blackouts. Yeah, you have severe weather, other nutcut events. You have insufficient tree trimming, which is is also very important in mountainous areas. Human operating errors, aging and degraded infrastructure. And if you look at this list, and then you know that the demand for electricity clearly is increasing over time, over the years, then one could really say this is really an increasing risk over time. However, most of the smaller blackouts are actually due to severe weather on the distribution sector, and not necessarily on the on the transmission sector. And this really is, for instance, a big difference to Central Europe electricity, because our distribution is all under the earth. In North America, you have it, like on wooden poles. So some lightning can already cause some local blackouts. However, if you really want to have a large scale and wide ranging blackout, then you really have to affect transmission lines. And if it should be long lasting as well, then it really have to affect also transformers. And there is this one particular peril here. Sorry, wrong direction. The solar storms, which seems to have a potential to do this particular harm. And this is just a motivational slide, what solar storms all can do, or what is all prone to solar storm as a hazard. The first thing that comes into mind, of course, is satellites. When it's exposed to these particle clouds coming from the sun, you have degradation on the satellites. You have these electricity disturbances in the satellites. And then there's, on the next level, you go down to the earth. Now the next thing is radio communication. The reflectivity of radio signals in the upper atmospheres is disturbed, and that also has already an effect on aviation. When there is no radio communication, no OTH, over the horizon radio, then flights have to be rerouted to different routes. And yeah, and if you then come to the ground, to the solar storm, to the ground effects, solar storm ground effects, there is this particular hazard of GIC, of geomagnetically induced currents, which has an effect on pipelines, on railroad signals, and on communication cables, but in particular on the high voltage transformers or the high voltage transmission grids. And I think what now here is written is basically more of a trivial thing, that the wide-ranging and long-lasting power outage could substantially affect like the worldwide economy, with extreme impacts on social life, supply chain disruptions, and then eventually even riots. Yeah. And so let's step a bit into physics. Let's look at some nice pictures here from the sun. If you look at the sun, please not without any protection, but if you would look at the sun in the visible spectrum, you would see a quiet sun at sometimes, and a more like active sun, as it's called. And the sun follows this 11-year cycle of activity, and activity here is meant by sunspots. There are sunspots that occur, and these sunspots are actually areas where the activity of the sun is very extreme. This is where all the solar storms actually originate. And if you look at the history of the sunspot cycles, you see that there's a nice 11-year periodicity in it, but it changes in activity. It really changes in activity, or in terms in intensity. We are at the moment somewhere here in between, like a low activity period, a minimum as it's called, and we are approaching the next maximum, which should peak around 2025. And however, these sunspots only make a statement on the frequency of extreme solar storms, not necessarily on their intensity. So even a weak solar cycle, or maybe even in periods in between maximum activity, you can also have strong solar storms. Now, what is a solar storm? Yeah, where does it come from? As I said, it comes from the sun. The sun actually is, like the Earth, a magnetic dipole. It has a north pole and a south pole. But every 11 years, it wants to switch polarity, and then it does a particular thing. It becomes what is called a multipole. And all these multipoles, these other additional north and south poles, are these sunspots. So one sunspot can be a magnetic north pole, and the neighboring sunspot can be a magnetic south pole, forcing these magnetic field lines to make these curvatures here. And when these sunspots then come very close to each other, these magnetic field lines that store a lot of energy in terms of tension, they can snap. And this then is the origin of a solar flare, or maybe even a so-called coronal mass ejection. like a huge explosion on the sun, where even parts of the sun's atmosphere of the corona can lift off and be emitted into space, which then is called the coronal mass ejection. Now, what is such a coronal mass ejection? It consists of plasma. Plasma is electrons and protons, and it travels with a percentage of the speed of light, so it's really fast. But the space between Sun and Earth isn't empty. It's filled with the slower traveling solar wind, but with slower, I don't actually mean slow. It's still 400 kilometers per second. But in such a coronal mass ejection approaches like that space, it first has to like swipe away, clean the path with the slower traveling solar wind. So it's slowed down by that solar wind until it reaches the planets. Now, the first thing that this plasma cloud sees when it approaches Earth is actually the Earth's magnetic field, and it interacts with it in two ways. So since this plasma cloud is electrically charged and like wobbling around on its way to the Earth, it creates its own not only electric field but its own magnetic field as well. And if the Earth's magnetic field is parallel in polarity, then it kind of shields us from that cloud. But if the polarity is counter in direction, like the opposite direction of the cloud, then it actually even opens up for such an incoming plasma cloud, or for the magnetic field, because the magnetic field lines actually combine then. But the effect in both cases are still kind of similar, and in both cases many plasma particles are dragged towards the north and south pole of the Earth, to the magnetic poles, and create what we know as these fast polar lights, or auroras. You know them in Canada very well. We don't see them that often in Europe. But this is basically the visible component of these conduction and induction processes that happen up there in the upper layers of the atmosphere, and basically show the vastness of these induction phenomena that are happening up there, in the magnetic phenomena. And these induction fields, actually, they interact, as I said, with the Earth's magnetic field. They forge it, they disturb it. And if this disturbance is stronger than, and this is just some sort of arbitrary definition by NOAA, but one has to start at some point, if this disturbance is stronger than 50 nanotesla in a 3-hour interval, then it's called a geomagnetic storm. Yeah, and this measurement, this DST index, is one of a handful of measurements that tries to describe the intensities of this geomagnetic disturbance. And yeah, but what does this mean here on the ground? The geology actually plays a very important role when it comes to intensities, because it can either dampen or even magnify these effects. So if you have this wobbling magnetic fields, they create these electric fields, and these electric fields actually shift currents in the geologies. Yeah, and then now we have different types of geologies. We have resistive geologies, we have conductive geologies. And you in Canada, here in the Northeast, you have a very particular resistive geology. It's very old rock, igneous rock, and very dry in that sense. Yeah, very not very very it's actually very resistive, and that means that the electric fields that can be created there can be very strong, and they can be, and this is now the estimate here, they can be up to 10 volts per kilometer, and 4 volts per kilometer have already been measured. Now, this unit, 10 volts or volts per kilometer, is a bit of an odd unit, because it's a density in physical terms. That means to make it very strong, to make it large, you have to integrate. You have to integrate over distances, over long distances, on different electrical potential. And we actually do have these machines that integrate over these distances. And these machines, these technologies, these are our electrical power grids. Yeah, if they span distances of a couple of 100 kilometers between grounding points, and then you can just, integrate over the distance, sum up over the distance, multiply it with this X volts per kilometer, and you get the voltage that is between these 2 points. And if the geology is more resistive than the offered alternative route through the grid, yeah, then the currents will take the path through the grids, and this is the so-called geomagnetically induced current. Yeah, and they can do harm to transformers and other electrical components in the grid. The strongest ever measured GIC was in Norway. It was 400 amps over 10 seconds. This is really long, because you must see our electricity system, both in Europe as well as in North America and everywhere on the earth, is basically built on alternating current. It's an AC system with 60 or 50 hertz, depending on where you are, on which continent. So a 10-second constant or more or less constant current of 400 amps is nearly an infinitely long time. It's like it's a direct current that disturbs this AC current. And this is actually the bad thing with GICs. Now, there were events that had caused blackouts and power outages and serious problems in the grids. The most famous one was actually in Canada. It was the 1989 Hydro-Quebec event. It started in the Hydro-Quebec power grid area in the northeast. But it had also, as you can see here on the map on the right side, it also has cascading effects basically all over the North American power grid. But the blackout were limited to Quebec, to the area of Quebec actually. But interestingly, the transformer damage, and this is the central point here, the central part is the transformer damage, has actually happened outside of that area. It has happened in New York near the Salem nuclear power plant. And but because of redundancies in the power grids, that did not cause a blackout or a bigger cascading effects in that area. So the grid there was able to buffer the problems, which was not the case in Hydro-Quebec, in the Hydro-Quebec area. So that power outage lasted for 9 hours on a Sunday night to actually Monday morning, I should say. It started in a Sunday night and went deep into the Monday, and it affected 6 million people. And damage to the grid was a couple of $1 million, and the total loss to Hydro-Quebec in terms of loss of revenue was also a couple of $1 million, because it was just 9 hours. So in that sense, it was not a big event. The question then is, can it become bigger? Yeah, it was like a warning shot, that event. There was another event in 2003, which was smaller in terms of all magnitudes, all physical magnitudes, but it was an interesting thing as well here. It happened in Malmö in Sweden, and at the same time also in South Africa. But the important thing, I think, the astonishing thing is what you see here. So the grid operators were informed about such an incoming CME by the space weather scientists at 8:04 in the evening, and 3 minutes later the outage occurred. This is just not enough time for any transmission system operator to do something useful. So you have to have a system that either automatically reacts on a disturbance, or that by design, can buffer these disturbances. The outage there only lasted for 15 minutes in the Malmö area, because it was not a big thing, luckily. But another interesting thing then happened on the other side of the earth in South Africa. There, 14 high voltage transformers were affected, and some tripped, some did not trip, and the ones that did not trip, they were the interesting ones, because these 14 high voltage transformers had to be replaced or repaired within the following year. And my best analogy I can come up with is, you're driving with your car on the highway, or in Germany on the Autobahn. You're going really fast, 150 kilometers per hour, 180 kilometers per hour, and you run over a stone, and your tire gets a bump. But all is fine, does not explode. You can continue. Yeah, you can continue. You can still go 150, 180 in Germany. Yeah, and then like after 500 further kilometers or so, a little stone can be enough to make your tire explode. Now, what was the origin of that problem? That is really difficult to find out. It needs kind of forensics to figure out what actually brought the transformers in a state that they actually failed weeks and months after. Yeah, and so what was the biggest event that we had there in history, or that is like our benchmark events for these cases? There was the famous Carrington event in 1859. Which actually was not a single event. It actually consisted of 2 huge solar flares followed by at least 2 CMEs, probably 4 to 5, but 2 really big ones within 4 days. And as I described earlier, that there is the slower traveling solar wind between the sun and the earth. The first one had to basically clear the path and impacted earth with not full force. But the second one really found its way into this better vacuum channel, and it really impacted then the earth in full force, and every reconstruction that was possible in terms of measurements and what we have said that it was at least 2,800 kilometers per second fast, so really fast, nearly a percentage of the speed of light. And this is twice the speed of a typically strong or fast CME. And these DST measurements, the magnetic disturbances, they were somewhere between, depending on where you were and depending on how you have to value the measurement at the given location, they were between 850 and 1700 nanoteslas. So really, really strong. And polar lights or auroras were visible as far as south as Venezuela, definitely not qualifying anymore for the term polar lights as far south as they were. And actually all telegraph lines that were there were actually affected by these GICs. The operators got all these little electroshocks. They were electrocuted, not heavily, but slightly. And some of the booths actually where they were sitting, and they actually caught fire because of that. And but the damage still was virtually none. Why? Well, we had no large scale grids at that time, no high voltage transmission grids. And yeah, then the question, typical reinsurance or insurance question, what's the return period of such an event? There's a very large debate going on how to rank that from a physical point, and it's somewhere ranked between a 200 and a 500 years. Some pessimistic people say it could be 150 year. There's some publication out there that even ranks it as 1,000+ year. But I personally think, and I had been working on this field as well, I personally think it is quite well ranked as a 200-year event. Could be 150, could be 250, could be 300, but as a roughly a 200-year event, I think this is a good qualification here, a good rank. Now there was another one actually quite recently in 2012, but it was a near miss. It missed the Earth by just 4 days. And just to tell you what it means, 4 days, please look at the map here on the lower right corner. So the center point is the sun. This one here is the Earth, and here we have 2 observing satellites, stereo A, stereo B. And the sun also turns around itself in 31 days. It has a period of 31 days to turn around itself. Like one sun day in that sense is 31 Earth days. And it emitted that extreme CME into that direction, and to turn from here to here just takes 4 days. So this one here, this black to dark red curvature here, this shows the CME, the extreme CME, and it missed the Earth. So, and Daniel Baker from University of Boulder, he's also associated to the Space Weather Prediction Center. He said that the July 2012 storm was in all respects at least as strong as the 1859 Carrington event. The only difference, it missed. Now, yeah. And actually, it tells us that even a weak solar cycle, because the previous solar cycle was quite weak, yeah, even a weak solar cycle can create or produce very strong storms. Now, what do these storms or these GICs actually do here on the ground? How do they impact the transformers? And as I said in the beginning, that our transformers are AC power systems, alternating power systems, and these GICs enter them through the grounding cables as DC currents, and they have the effect that they disturb this magnetization of a transformer's core. So a transformer oscillates its magnetic polarity 50 or 60 times per second, and to create these its own electrical and magnetic fields. And so yeah, okay. Oh, let me explain it like this. There are two major disturbing effects. The one is the harmonics, and the other one are the hotspots. The harmonics is, think about a pendulum. You have a pendulum that pendles that swings from left to right, and then you put a little wall on one side that it does not get the full amplitude, that it hits this before it gets 0 speed. It hits this little wall, and it is reflected with the speed with the opposite direction. And what does that do? It increases its frequency. If you do that, it becomes faster and faster and faster. Yeah, and this is very, very bad for the power grid. This can actually lead to the fact that there is some remaining magnetization in the transformer, and this with these harmonics, with these changes in its frequency, will lead to a heating of the transformer. There are protective measures implemented in the transformer that can, switch it off or trip it from the system so that the heating will not damage it. But the question then always is, where is the threshold? Maybe some damage has already occurred before it trips, or maybe the tripping even fails. Now, this other thing is even meaner, this hotspot thing that can happen. This is, you can have a stray currents in this whole system, stray currents, and they can, in that sense, attack the insulation of the transformer windings, the cellulosis insulation, and basically burn little holes in that. And it's like a needle prick into a balloon for the transformer. And these little holes then can lead to the fact that transformer these copper coils can get fused to each other, neighboring transformer coils, and then you can throw away the whole machine. You cannot repair it. It's gone. This little needle pinch breaks you the whole machine. And so those are the two main effects. And the question then is, how susceptible is our or the North American power system to these types of effects? And for this, we have, again, to dig a little bit deeper. So most of the operative transformers in the North American power grid were actually built in the 70s with a designed lifetime of 40 to 50 years. So let's do the math. 70 plus 50 is somewhere around 2020. So a well-maintained transformer can easily, become older without any problem, but it still means it's overaged equipment that is implemented in the North American power grid, on the Canadian side as well as on the US side, and also here in Europe. And aged infrastructure usually or generally means increased vulnerability. So transformers exposed to strong GRC, as I said, might not fail, but degrade faster, degrade slower, but definitely degrade and become more vulnerable. And degraded and old equipment usually shows higher susceptibility to failure. Now, there are two other driving factors. The one is the grid itself. It's growing because of the higher demand of electricity over the decades. The typical line lengths the total length of the power grid. Now here we have the example for the US, but this is probably very similar in Canada, has grown to an immense length. Yeah, and actually, I think the line length in the US is sort of similar to the one in Canada. And it's probably the total length that we have here. If I see it now, the 160,000 miles. Well, but the thing is, it's not only the line length, it's also the resistivity or the resistance, electrical resistance of the lines. And the more you go into the higher voltages, the less resistance you have. There's an economic reason to do that, because the less resistance you have in your high voltage, extra high voltage power lines, the less loss you have, the less friction you have, the more power you can actually transmit from A to B. So we are, by having this economic, drive to have better and better optimized power grids with less resistivity, with less resistance, we actually open the door even further for GICs. Increased high voltage transmission line length plus decreasing resistance means enhanced potential of GIC impacts. Now, what can we do against it? There are mitigation strategies and measures out there. The first one is the trivial one. Let's stop the GIC itself by implementing some DC plug-in devices into the grounding cables, between the transformer and the ground. Yeah, that would block the GIC clearly. However, we need these groundings simply, as just one example, to get rid of extra currents that might be deposited into the grid through lightning, through usual thunderstorms. Yeah, so that they cannot cause cascading effects, that they can, basically dissipate or move out of the grid to the next grounding cable. Yeah, so this is clearly not the ultimate option. We could stop the GIC from causing transformer saturation and generating harmonics. Yes, there are now new technologies, new transformer designs that can do that. However, I think not even 1% of the installed transformers has this technology. We can make use of relays with digital filters that can have a better way of reacting, of responding to the harmonics if they show up. So there are lots of engineering solutions, and also additionally to the engineering solutions, sometimes they are not the optimal solution. Sometimes you just need better operating procedures. But combined, this is quite a good set of reactions of mitigation measures, yeah, that we can have. So improved operating procedures, one could be, or one very important one is to make sure that you provide enough capacity, enough what's it called in English? Sorry, reactive power. This is power that you cannot use commercially. This is just power that acts as a buffer to disturbances in the grid. So this is probably one of the most important thing, but it comes with a cost again. And other strategies or early strategies were there that were like, okay, why not just disconnecting the grid if there is a solar storm incoming? And the grid operator said, no, let's not do that, because there's a reason why we have connected the grids in the first place. And this is exactly to distribute every disturbance that we have on many shoulders, on many nodes, on many transformers. Yeah. So they would not do that. And splitting the grid also provides the risk that it might, collapse. So yeah, what did actually Hydro-Quebec do after the 1989 event? They did some recalibration of protection systems, raising the trip levels. They implemented some real-time alert systems in the power grid during magnetic storms. They did some modification of power system operation procedures. So you see, it's basically a little bit of everything that was just on the list before. Yeah, and they did the installation of the series compensators on power lines to enhance also grid stability. And the consequence or the statement that Hydro-Quebec makes is that today there is an international network that monitors the sun's activity through satellites and observations. The data is then used by regional centers to predict disturbances. One of these centers located in Ottawa posts a weather report, a space weather report on the internet, and updates it every hour, so we are alerted ahead of time. Forewarned is forearmed. I think it is fair to assume that a repeat of the 1989 event today would actually be a non-event for the Quebec power grid, for Hydro-Quebec. Yeah. They have implemented protective measures up to they say, 100-year return period threshold. However, what if the next event is not a 100-year event, but a 200-year, 300 or 500-year event? Yeah. Now, some more slides, a few more slides here on technology that is available. So ABB and Siemens, two of the main producers of these transformers, they actually claim that they can now build machines which are immune to solar storms, yeah, which can cope with every which comes with a special hotspot design so that it's not vulnerable against GICs anymore. This is all fine and great, and I actually believe that these are huge improvements. However, fair question. What is the possible maximum strength of GIC from an engineering perspective that was used as a benchmark for these designs to come up with these statements? Was this sufficient? We don't know. And so how strong can a solar storm be? This is the ultimate question here. We have to find the red line between science and fiction. Yeah, we have to extrapolate into extremes that we might have not seen yet, but which are still realistic. Yeah, and I think from an insurance perspective, we have quite a reasonable way to label these. There are the 100 years event, the 200 years, 500 years, and 1,000 years events. So we have to ask these questions. For instance, like what is actually a 200-year strong solar storm, a 200-year strong GIC, yeah, and then we can use this and check how our technology that would be prone to these forces would react on these types of events in terms of resistance and resilience, yeah, in the system, and then we can deduct and see what we have to do. Do we have to implement better standards so that we can harden the grid? Now, this just shows some work that has been done, how to extrapolate with extreme value statistics to these extreme geoelectric fields. And the conclusion was, or basically the benchmarks were, that for conductive geologies, which is the less vulnerable geology, to be honest, it is somewhere between it's below like these 10 volts per kilometer, somewhere around 4 volts per kilometers. But for the more amplifying geologies, for the resistive geologies, it can go up to 10, 20 volts per kilometer. Yeah, and so the question, what actually is the 1 in 100 year value against which we have to prepare or design our equipment, and is the 1 in 100 year event actually severe enough? Should we maybe go for higher values? Because if we say the Carrington event is our benchmark event, shouldn't we then protect against 200 plus years? Yeah. There was a study by the Center of Risk Study of the Cambridge University, and they have designed scenarios. They follow the scenario approach. Yeah. Whenever you can't do proper scaling assigned with probabilities, then you have to make use of scenario approaches and just assume, okay, this is now what happens. No matter how, if this is a 10-year, 100-year, or 1,000-year event, we just assume this happens. What do we do? What's the outcome, and what do we do? And they have 3 different types of scales of scenarios, the S1, S2, and the X1, as outcomes of a potential Carrington type event. So the S1 would be the mild outcome. Yeah, the S2 would be the medium outcome, and the X1 would be the extreme outcome. So the X1 scenario assumes that in the North American power grid, circa 80 critical high voltage transformers would be severely damaged or even destroyed because of GIC, and that would cause restoration times of between 30 and 365 plus days, so between 30 days and a year, between a month and a year. And initially, in such a scenario, you would see a power blackout with 150 million people affected in the Northeast, affected for probably a week. Then 50 million, then would still be affected for at least 5 months. This is really bad. And 10 million people would still be without power for a year at certain areas, certain locations. It's difficult to say where these areas are. There are like simulations run on the grids to figure out where the most vulnerable spots are. But the nasty thing is, if you protect a certain area in this network of transformers and make it immune, for instance, against these effects, what does this node in the grid do? It just passes the problem to the next weakest link in the node. So it's not that it might, and this is actually a change in topology of the grid. It actually could mean that you have, protected certain nodes, certain areas in your grid, but by doing so, you have actually increased the vulnerability or the risk of a failure of other areas. So now back to the scenario. What was the economic impact of that scenario? They did a very thorough analysis on all sorts of economic sectors, and also in that sense in our language lines of potential business here, and they came up with a total economic loss of 2.7 trillion or 3.9% of global GDP. Some people might know the famous Kappenman scenario, which is even bigger. John Kappenman, in, 20 years ago, destroyed about 300 or 380 or 360 transformers in the North American power grid. And he ended up with a scenario with a blackout in the similar areas for about 1 to 4 years. But even if you scale down that scenario, the economic impact is very similar. And this is the interesting lessons learned. Even scaled down, and by that, more likely scenarios still carry the enormous potential of huge losses, economic losses, and also, of course, then potentially insured losses. But the important outcome here, and this is then I think where we'll hand over to Eric, is I think this sentence here. So we think risks associated with a Carrington as if extreme solar storm go beyond insurance and will ultimately need to be dealt with by collaborations across governments, businesses, and the wider society. If an event like this happens with this scale, with this magnitude, we, the insurance sector, we won't be the solution provider. We won't be the one who mitigate these impacts. If you have shortages in supply, if you suffer from a blackout for a month, money doesn't help you. Yeah. So this is really something where society, governments, businesses, industries really sit together at the table and think, how can we solve that problem? So just maybe a quick slide. There are some initiatives out there, and particularly for North America, I think for you of interest is the so-called National Space Weather and Action Strategy Plan from the White House. It was initiated by the Obama administration, and it was not canceled by the Trump administration. And so there's really something going on in the North American power grid to harden this grids to implement new standards. And also on the insurance side, we had these task force during the last solar maximum about 10 years ago. It started with a working group in the Geneva Association. The first members were Allianz, Swiss Re, Lloyd's, and Munich Re. And we had some seminars, some publications, and then we had oh, that was too fast, sorry. And then we had another round of a solar storm task team organized at the Geneva Association. But we very early noticed that our goals, will not be changing, like, how we in the insurance market actually, structure our contracts or so, but rather we have to strive for awareness in these among these particular stakeholders of governments and industries, bring them to one table. We have to do lobby work to reduce the vulnerability, to make sure that on the long term, the vulnerability against this type of peril will be reduced, and it will take time. It will not be achieved within 5 or 10 years. The whole grid has grown over decades, and it will take decades to adapt it to these new demands. Okay, so I think now I will hand over to Eric, or do we have questions first? I don't know. Please let me know.
Are there people out there with questions for Jan before we jump to Eric's presentation? Very fascinating. It's scary as hell as well with the vulnerabilities. So Deepika, could I please ask you to turn on your video and activate your mic? Great.
Hi, I apologize for the background. We just recently updated our brand, so I was playing around with that this morning. Thank you for a really excellent presentation. I wanted to ask you whether a Carrington event, is that meant to be a double flare or a double CME event impacting the Earth, or is it just one single high speed event?
It's actually the really big ones are usually multiple events. There are multiple explosions occurring on the sun, and if as I said, the first one usually is sort of dampened through the slower traveling solar wind between the sun and the planets, but that kind of creates a better vacuum behind it, and that means the second and third ones are usually the ones that impact with really strong force. The fourth and fifth ones then again are already weaker because the potential energy on the sun's surface, at the sunspots has already been sort of used up. So it's usually a sequence of events.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Are there other questions out there before we move on to our next presentation? Okay, seeing none, let's then jump to Eric. Thanks, Jan. That was very informative.
Thank you, Jan, for setting so well the base. Everybody's scared now, so I can talk relaxed. Possibly the question just before from Deepika was more insurance related than we think, because the question was one event or two events, which obviously for some insurance covers could be very critical. And I don't have the answer, but we might keep that in the back of our head. Let me share my presentation. And if somebody can tell me if it comes out correctly.
It is perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So the one of the first questions we have obviously is how often? How often can that happen? And we had a hint of an answer by Jan before. I've as well taken a copy of that AER, which is Atmospheric and Environmental Research, which together with Lloyd's also made a study a few years ago. And we see here exactly what Jan said, the 1859, then the 1921, 1989, the Hydro-Quebec one, and the 2003 South Africa and Scandinavia. But on top of that, interesting is that newest publications show that in 1770, Of course, there was no technology. There were no magnetometers to measure the magnetic field. But they are recording that there were 9 nights in series of intense auroral activity in low latitude Asia. And again, remember the slide that Jan showed. When you have northern lights, auroral lights in Cuba, then you know you have a very strong solar storm. And then also that one, the 2012, the Carrington type CME, we just missed the year. So if you kind of look at return period, 1770, 1859, 1921, this one not necessarily true because it was only a medium one, and then 2012, you get also a kind of an idea about a possible return period. And how large the impact? Frequency is one thing, impact is the other, obviously. So Jan mentioned John Kappelman. Yes, 1 trillion, 200 to 300 transformers affected. Quite a mega storm, really. Then this study from Lloyd's and AER, as I mentioned it just before, which comes as well to the same type of order of magnitude, both in terms of length at the maximum places and in terms of monetary loss, economic loss. And then the Cambridge one, again, I will not repeat what Jan explained very well. So there are at least 3 studies which say, we might have a major problem here waiting for us. And then looking into the literature, there are a couple of authors which have tried to dig deeper into the matter. And 2 of them are mentioned here. One is Eastwood and always in collaboration with other authors, which have reviewed literature on economic losses, and mentioned one interesting author, which also looked at the non-catastrophic losses due to solar storms. Exactly what Jan mentioned with the degradation of the transformers. And there they mentioned that those non-catastrophic losses over the years could bring several billion of damages to transformers over the years. And suddenly you have to replace your transformer not every 40 years, but every 20 years. Another study looked into much more granular making of a CME, and especially of the impact, the geomagnetic storm, and looked at really substorms, as Jan was saying, that CME wobbles with its own magnetic field, and that creates substorms. And then looked also at what will happen in the future. The recovery of the economy, is there a possible rebound effect, a positive rebound effect? And also on the forecast, are we improving our forecast? And with that, taking a medium value both for the expected recovery and a medium value for the improvement in forecast possibilities, still come to a very large number. Horton as well published and looked at the daily economic impact of extreme space weather and said, depending on which scenario we looked at, a daily loss of 7 to 48 billion. So if you multiply that with 100 days, obviously you have a very large number. But there are less alarming views as well. NERC, and Canada is also linked to the NERC, the North Energy Reliability Commission, I believe, is it? Said, well, no, we don't believe those Agamemnon views on how long it could last. What they believe is that there will be some damage to the bulk power system assets and obviously a loss of reactive power. Jan mentioned that. Voltage instability, power collapse due to the harmonics that Jan described. Another well-known institution in the States, working for the Department of Homeland Security, went so far as saying they don't believe into the scenarios of Kappenman, but they don't say what they believe. They just say they're not convinced that the worst case is plausible, but they do not say where they see the major weakness, also because the algorithm used were not shared, obviously. So there are views of very large storms and views which say, well, it's not that bad. And talking about that bad, well, what is so bad in terms of impact? Impact to society first. We like to separate if you have an electric blackout or if you have not an electric blackout, because you can have damages and disturbances just by the mere presence of a solar storm, of a geomagnetic disturbance. And you have satellites. Satellites can be even damaged depending on which type of solar storms you have. But it certainly can be disturbed with regard to communication, but also all the type of sensors that they use. Communication in general, we heard it. The banking world, which depends a lot on very, very precise timing signals, which they nowadays take from the GPS or the GNSS, the Global Navigation Satellite System. Now, obviously, they would turn on some other types of time measurement devices. They have very precise clocks on reserve, but that doesn't go without some disturbances. Aviation and radar, we heard about it, pipelines and corrosion, especially the rail networks, disturbance to the signals, and the optical fiber networks. That's an interesting one. And obviously, we'll nowadays with the internet, which did not really exist yet in 1989, the optical fibers themselves are immune to the GICs, to those geomagnetically induced currents. But they need electricity every so many dozens of kilometers, the repeaters. And those ones are fed by electric lines, very regular electric lines. And that could be the weak points of the internet cables under the ocean, for instance. When the solar storm is intense enough that it does create a blackout, then obviously you probably have already heard about those impacts on the industry at large, probably also some types of nonlinear impacts there. Think about melting ovens. They might survive for 1 day or 2 days without electricity, but then suddenly that molten metal will solidify and you can throw away the whole thing. So they are non-linear, non-proportional effects as well. Transportation will be disturbed, communication, internet, water, other utilities, etc., etc. If we look then further down the line to the insurance industry, where can the insurance industry be impacted again? If we looked at without the blackout, then obviously space insurance, aviation insurance will pick up some bills through the loss of communication, through the disturbance from the GPS, GNSS. If we then look at, there will be blackout, but without transformer damages. That would be if the triggering mechanisms of those high voltage transformers or the other devices on the network, there are more which can be disturbed and more which can be triggered off. You could have, and that's almost to be hoped, that those triggering effects will work. And in that sense, that the blackouts will be only short-termed, because it's much easier to start again the grid than to repair damaged transformers. You would have the same as above, plus the extensions to the contingent business interruption, also called often off-premise power or service interruption or public or non-public utilities, depending on the trigger. Obviously, many of those extensions to the BI need or request to have had a property damage, but some might not. And in that sense, those ones which do not request such a tangible property damage at the cause of the blackout will be triggered and insurance companies will indemnify. And then obviously, if you have damaged transformers, you have a physical damage in the chain of causation, and all the type of CBI, contingent business interruption, will be triggered. And then you obviously have on top of it physical damage to the transformers themselves, which in the grand scheme of things are not that expensive. A large transformer might cost 10 millions, yes, but compared to what we saw as possible damage to the economy, it's little. You have the BI of the electricity providers as well. And then you have indirect impact to the insurance industry. The whole of supply chain, which normally has not really been taken into consideration in the calculation of the losses. Then you have assets and stock markets going down as a follow from the economic downturn. And John mentioned it, the SRCC, the strike, riot, civil commotion. Imagine you have Boston without electricity for 2 months. Obviously, that will not be a quiet moment at all. Now changing the scene, we've seen the solar storm, but other things can happen to the power grid. And I thought I would spend a couple of minutes on the cyber, how to attack the electric power grid. And there are different ways to do that. You can get into the TSOs, the transmission system operator in North America, rather called the independent system operator or the regional transmission operator. Intrusion into their computer systems or into their SCADA system, the supervisory control and data acquisition system, and stop the computers of the TSO, for instance. And you can stop the flow of electricity after, not even an hour, and but that without property damage as well. Of course, you can also create property damage with a cyber attack. If you attack, for instance, the cooling system of the generators, your generator will grip or even catch fire. Might be easier to do than entering into the TSOs, but was less of a, how shall I say, of a potential for large-scale disturbance or destruction. You can probably, a well-organized cyber hacker team can attack 1 or 2 power generation centers, because they are all a little bit different. They all have a different system of actuators. They all have another software, which means it's very difficult to do that at a very large scale. The third one is a bit more intriguing. It's due to the smart grid, consumers and producers, which might not be very well protected against cyber attacks. We are of the opinion that that might come, but smart grid really is still in its infancy compared to its potential. So I think we wrote 5 years ago 10 to 15, so probably, to be honest, we should say in 10 years it's going to be more a critical issue. And if this happened, where could it have the largest effect? And we are of the opinion it's by attacking a TSO. And we looked at what the literature says. And again, the Cambridge University made a study in 2015 together with Lloyd's and the Department of Homeland Security. They did not choose the same path as we did. They went on to the generation and said, okay, what could happen? And again, it's in their way of thinking. They always do 3 scenarios, always called S1, S2, and X1, and said that almost 100 million of US citizens would be without power for 2 to 7 days. Quantification, less than what we saw for the solar storm, but still between 60 to 200 billion US dollars. These are kind of the direct economic costs. If you look at the footnote at the bottom, when they use another method, the GDP at risk, which takes everything, they come to a loss almost 5 times as large. The insurance is about 1/3 of it. So we would be talking about an insurance loss, in this case, of 20 to 70 billion. There are other literature on the topic. Some of them are more summer literature for your holidays, the Blackout novel. Then you have better research, journalistic work, Lights Out from Ted Koppel, and you have some other professional publications, Power Blackouts Risk from the Chief Risk Officer Forum. We also wondered, okay, all of them are more America, Blackout is Germany. Can we also quantify Germany and France? Why Germany and France? Because they have very different type of electricity distribution and transmission. Effectively, the transmission in Germany is done over 4 independent TSOs, and France 1 TSO and only one, belonging even to the electricity production. So a very different setup. And that's why we looked at America, we looked at Germany, and looked at France. For the cyber here, we look at this being the example for North America. We looked at how long will it be? And we think cyber attack to the TSO can totally stop the electricity for 2 days. And then you have a gradual restoration of the electricity supply. Why the gradual restoration? Because the power plants will be started again in what they call an island operation. They are not synchronized with the other parts of the grid. That has the advantage they can be started quite fast. It has the disadvantage that they themselves are quite unstable because they don't have the possibility to tap into the electricity supply of other parts of the grid if they have an instability. So they try to reconnect, and that takes time. The problem is not so much of the frequency, because they all run in the state 60 Hertz, but the phase of their supply of energy. And that reconnection sometimes make them fall down again, and they have to start again. So the expectation is that the reconnection is fast in the beginning, but during that reconnection and synchronization process, it will take time up to almost 2 weeks until really everybody has electricity again. And the last one, you know that much better than I do, so I will be very short, only one slide on this one. The ice storms in Canada, at the example of 1998. I took this information from an RRMS special report, which described it. So just for our memory, 4 million people suffering from the blackout, about 10% of that for 2 weeks. There were, interestingly enough, a lot of claims, more than Hurricane Andrew. And the economic loss was of the order of magnitude of 3 billion in Canada and a little bit over 1 billion in the US part. Again, this factor about 3 between the economic and the insured loss. So we wondered how large is the impact for Swiss Re. Obviously, the scientific part, the economic part, the general insurance part is very interesting, but there is a purpose to do all this study, is to understand how could it impact Swiss Re. So something like 10 years ago, Swiss Re, and that was the time, as you saw, there were those works and teamwork with the Geneva Association. We also commissioned a study with one of our scientific institutions in Switzerland. And they looked at Europe first, and then more specifically to Scandinavia, because it seems to be the most at-risk region within Europe. And said, yes, well, continental Europe, not that much in danger of very long blackouts. Scandinavia, a bit more, but have you thought about the USA? So we again looked at the USA and thought we need an American research association to help us. The physics of it from the sun to the geomagnetically induced currents is much too complex. And we looked around, and we, in the end, commissioned the MIT to do a study for us to look at how much, not to do a study in terms of quantitative assessment for our portfolio, but we wanted to know how credible are all the hundreds of publications on the different steps from the sun, the CMEs, the GMDs, the geomagnetically disturbance, then the GIC, the electric field, the GICs, and then the disturbance in the different parts of the grids, the transformers, and everything that Jan said about how all the transformers, the type of construction of the transformers was not mentioned yet, depending on which tab, the one phase, the three phase, they have different vulnerability to the GICs. And they showed the MIT, after almost 1 year of studies, that there were a lot of question marks, both on the frequency of such events and on the severity. So much on the frequency as well, just a little bit joke. They told us, well, there is too little observation of the sun. With our satellites, we might have 30 years of observation of the sun. That's much too little. They need hundreds of years of observation of the sun. Or conversely, we could subsidize the construction of a satellite to observe 100 sun-like stars during 1 year, and that would do the deal. So we kind of said, no, thank you. That goes a little bit too far. But the output of the study was a lot of question marks. So to have a quantification at hand still, we looked at what this Helios study is that Jan mentioned from the Cambridge University. And it looks really at each and every substation. So we went into the FERC reports and looked at where are the substations in each and every counties per states. We then looked at what voltage are they. And we also looked at, do they have spares? And that's probably one of the very positive points. There are spares around, too few, much too few. And this would be a possibility. It costs a little bit to begin with, but with that, you know that if your high voltage transformers is damaged and you have a spare, the spares, as long as it's not under electricity when the storm hits, no problem. Then an important point is the geomagnetic latitude, which is a little bit different to the geographic latitude, and then the resistivity of the ground that Jan was mentioning, the rock, how much is conductive, how much is resistive. The situation is a bit more complex. It's basically needs an equivalent impedance, which depends on the resistivity over hundreds of kilometers deep. And there are studies showing, as you can see on the right-hand side, the type of resistivity or impedance according to the depth in the soil. So we looked at that as well. And then we looked at proximity to the sea, because that creates a discontinuity in the resistivity, which has also critical effects. And then there is a very empirical step as well on the vulnerability of the transformers. And you can play around with all those parameters and then come up to, for a given scenario, and here for a scenario which takes into account the amplitude of and the duration of the S2, you can look at how many transformers will not be impacted at all, how many will be tripped, so they are out of electricity for, say, 5 days, and then they can be reconnected. Slightly damaged, so they might need 3 months to be repaired, subject to not having spares at that place. If they are spared, within 2 weeks, you have moved your transformer, reconnected it, re-energized it, and it's working. This is the expectation. And for the ones which are destroyed, basically in percentage, very small, but it still can mean a lot, as we saw, 100 or 200, and the number of days can be very long. There are even the X1 scenario would say 1 year without electricity in that region served by this transformer. So a complex calculation, which gives us now an idea about what percentage of the population, what percentage of the industry in North America will be without electricity for how long. And then we look at our policies. Normally, it's all the property and engineering policies which cover somehow the CBI, the off-premise power, things like that. We know that we have a physical damage, so that the trigger is less of importance. And for all those insurance policies that we have, we look at the revenue of that corporate, which is insured, and we transform that, calculate that into a daily revenue and say, okay, 20 days without electricity. This is how much revenue is at loss, and then look at the insurance conditions for loss of profit insurance. We apply all the policy conditions. It's a very bottom-up calculation. And then we apply any type of insurance and or reinsurance conditions to it for facultative, for instance. And again, the policy trigger here would be basically almost 100%. Summing up over the whole of our portfolio, and I have made here some simplification, obviously, gives us our Swiss Re exposure. But calculating, obviously, how much it would cost us is a bit passive. We also want to understand what can we do, right? What can be done? Not only we. As Jan was saying, it's certainly a question of shared interest and shared responsibility. So with terms of preparation, early warning. We haven't talked about the early warning yet. I'm not a satellite specialist, but the early warnings given by those satellites, which can give us not only an indication on how strong that CME is in terms of its dimension, but also the magnetic field it carries. As Jan was saying, if it shows south-north, it's less of a problem than if it shows north-south. And the warning there is half an hour, roughly speaking. So not much for the transmission system operators to do something out of it. Which means they have the shutdown and run-up procedures in place and tested. The new technologies, the transformers that Jan was mentioning, with some retrofit possibles as well. The reserves and the backups in place, and even movable spares. The spares I was mentioning before in our study are the non-movable. They are already on site. Now remember, those extremely high voltage transformers can weigh anything up to 400 tons. So you don't just carry them easily, and they're large. So regular roads, that won't work. So there has been a test. Some energy companies in the States have started to build single-phase spares, which they can transport on a large truck. They carry 3 of them in a row, and then they can be connected. But again, this was only a pilot study, and I fear that it has not been carried out at scale. And of course, not only the energy industry can do something in terms of preparation and mitigation, but everybody else, all the consumers, corporates, associations can do business continuity plans. What would happen if I have no electricity? Obviously, not good if you have, not good enough if you have 3 months without electricity, but in case of a milder form, that might help, or that will help. Raise the knowledge base, further studies, the NERC benchmark still in development. And also there are other countries, such as the UK, which have now a national severe space weather strategies or action plan or national plans. Last but not least, raise the awareness with the governance, with publications on the topic, and with associations, and effectively raise awareness, ladies and gentlemen. Is that Jan and what I have been trying to do tonight. So with this, I would go back to the organizers, Ian, and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Eric. Are there questions out there? Very fascinating. Talking about vulnerabilities and impacts on society and mitigation efforts. Very equal parts frightening and informative. I would describe it as.
Indeed.
Okay, Alistair, you have a question, please.
Yes, and thank you to both our outstanding experts for this rather sobering combination of presentations. So I may have missed this because you were giving me more complexity than I'm intellectually capable of handling. But did I miss an explanation of the probability of such a storm hitting one part of the planet or another? I assume most of the modeling is done where there's more or less grids, but it was hard not to feel a bit personal about the scope of the impact on the north when I see Quebec and Malmo as two of the powerful examples. Is the North Pole closer to the likely area of attack, or is it more randomly spread around the whole planet?
Yeah, I think that's one for you.
Yes, these thoughts are debated. There is a clear signal in that sense that the north and the south, everything that's closer to the magnetic poles, sees more frequent events. However, large events tend to have the signature that they reach further south. And as I said, it's all about voltage per kilometer. It's about distances to integrate over areas on different electrical potential. And that actually means that also the rims of these footprints can have a particular, can contribute particular to that problem. So that means while areas like Scandinavia and parts of Canada, why it's their everyday's business to see these effects in smaller scales. Areas like here in central Germany or even further south on a geomagnetic latitude like in central US or so, they will only see large events. They will not see small events. So, and this is the big question mark. If you are well trained because you're exposed to small events, I exaggerate, every day, yeah, then you might also know what to expect when a strong event comes. But someone who is not well trained, who is not in a permanent, status of being in training because of small events, might have no clue at all what it means when there is suddenly a large event. Yeah. And to explain a little bit why this further south can happen, there are two contributors to these geomagnetic disturbances near the Earth. The one is both are sort of permanent plasma clouds that circulate the Earth. The one is the equatorial ring current, also known as the Van Allen belt. And there are other so-called auroral electrojets or polar electrojets, currents stored or sort of captured near the poles. And the latter ones, they are the ones that are typically activated. That means contributing to this phenomenon during typical extreme events. But when there is a very extreme event, Carrington type event, then we know that this equatorial ring current is highly activated as well, and this carries more potential. And this makes these extreme events reaching further south. So we have looked into this, like, can we, because when we look at typical events or every events where we have data, where we have real measured data, we saw a natural boundary around the 50th degree of geomagnetic latitude, corresponding, depending on where you are, with the 50th degree of geographical latitude. But we didn't see effects near the equator, but we know there are reports. There are reports from Rome, from India. There are the polar lights from Venezuela, from Mexico. Yeah, but this is all from times when there was no real measurements, no reliable measurements.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I was just wondering whether we should be more personally exposed in Canada. Ian, if it's okay, I'm conscious of time. Let me just try one more on the practical end.
Sure.
That might be for the other colleague participating. If I am a property and casualty insurance underwriter, one of the things I like to think of is that I'm better at risk selection than others. So how do I think about pricing and risk selection for this risk? A, if I'm a personal lines insurer, and B, if I'm a commercial lines insurer. Is there some practical advice you could offer the 90 plus people who stayed on the line throughout this entire technical briefing?
Oh, that's a difficult one, obviously. First, you have to think in terms, okay, are you underwriting the consumers or the producers? as we saw sometimes, even the producers, we have the BI. So that is also something. But effectively, the least of the insurance companies have introduced some type of either a cost element or even a capital cost element to the solar storms. This has not yet made it into the underwriting world, I believe. And there is a good reason for it. It's the uncertainty which surrounds it. As we showed, there is quite some uncertainty in terms of the severity, and even more in terms of the frequency or the return period. And that makes such an assessment extremely difficult. So I must say, no, I don't have any good tip to give tonight.
So it's just an embedded reality that's part of the risk premium that we need to charge as part of our cost of capital across all lines.
Effectively, often you will put in any other risk or any other perils a loading to your calculation, and that should take it into consideration. And effectively, same thing for the capitalization of the company. You have all the risks that you have modeled into your internal risk model, and then you multiply that by a safety factor, and that should cover it.
Thank you, and thank you both.
If I may add, I think what Eric showed on one of his last slides is a homework that every insurance company should do. You should take a scenario, an extreme scenario. It doesn't have to be the ultimate extreme scenario, but take an extreme scenario and actually see what it actually means to you and your business. See how exposed you are, and then draw the consequences then from there.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Very, very helpful information. We always try to do a deep dive with our Emerging Risks webinar into risk issues that maybe we haven't covered before that should be on people's minds, and you've certainly accomplished that today. So I want to thank our speakers, Dr. Eric Durand, Head Cyber Center of Competence, Director Swiss Re Institute, Swiss Re Management Ltd, and Dr. Jan Eichner, Senior Consultant, Corporate Underwriting Non-Life with Munich Re. Very, very fascinating discussion. And I want to touch on, before we say goodbye to everybody, our next event. We don't like to have registrations out there for competing events, so you're going to see this tomorrow. Dinik is going to put up for me, thank you, perfect. We have a very fulsome agenda for our November 17th Risk Officers Forum meeting. That is the final meeting of the year. We're going to have Jason Stora, CEO of Aviva Canada, come and speak to us about the CEO perspective on climate change. And that will be followed by a panel presentation or a presentation by Dr. Sandra Chapman. She's Director, Center of Fusion Space and Astrophysics and Professor with the Department of Physics at the University of Warwick in Coventry in the UK. She's going to be talking about the risks of space weather phenomena. So in a sense, continuing on a little bit with today's discussion, maybe a little bit different focus. And finally, an industry panel discussion. It's the greatest unkept secret out there. November 16th, OSFI is doing their annual risk management seminar, and our event follows the next day. So we're going to have a panel discussion featuring Mark Lipman, attorney, in fact, in Canada, Lloyd's Underwriters and president of Lloyd's Canada, Bernard McNulty, Chief Agent Canada and Head of Claims Canada for Allianz Global Corporate and Specialty, the Canada branch, and Ryan Viekman, Vice President, Insurance Risk Management with TD Insurance, are going to be giving us their thoughts and engage in a group discussion on what they saw and heard at the annual risk management seminar. So thanks again, Jan and Eric, for being here during the dinner hour. We certainly benefited from your discussion. I think we're sending off 100 experts now, or 100 plus experts on solar storms into the industry to wreak havoc. So certainly appreciate that. Everybody out there, you'll see a satisfaction survey tomorrow. So we certainly appreciate your thoughts on ways to make our events better, ideas for speakers and subject matter. We benefited today from past suggestions to cover off solar storms. So thank you for that. And watch for the registration forms tomorrow. And in the meantime, thanks for joining us, and stay safe, and we will see you soon. Thank you and goodbye.